Well, Book TV is on location at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where we're interviewing some professors who are also authors. Joining us now is Charles Kurzman. His most recent book is The Missing Martyrs: Why There Are So Few Muslim Terrorists. Professor Kurzman, you write in your book, the bad news for Americans is this: Islamist terrorists really are out to get you. Then you go on to say that the good news for Americans is this: there aren't very many of them.
It seems counterintuitive, I think, because terrorism is so often in the news, and we see horrible attacks around the world, and even here in the United States. Of course, on September 11th, 2001, the worst in memory. But then more recently as well, the Boston Marathon bombings last year, and arrests here and there, and plots being disrupted. But if you step back for a second and think, what is the overall picture, the threat assessment for public safety in the United States and around the world? There isn't nearly as much terrorism as we were afraid there might be. In the weeks and the months after 9/11, experts were telling us to expect the new normal, that we were going to get attacks like this on a regular basis. And we haven't. And in fact, even though we don't want to dismiss this threat, I want to put it in perspective, and the book tries to do that. It tries to say, how come we haven't seen more, and what is the scale of the threat to public safety from terrorism versus other sorts of threats?
Put some numbers
Sure.
to this. How many terrorists are there in the world?
I've tried to estimate that based on declassified documents and all sorts of reports by security professionals. And it appears that there are fewer than 100,000 terrorists. Now that sounds like a huge number, 100,000 people. That's a swarm of people out to get us. But almost all of those are folks who are focused on their own country. What they want to do is make a revolution in their own country, far away from here, in basically a handful of places where there's really active revolutionary Islamist movements. So the bulk of those, more than 90%, are no threat to Americans here in the United States. They're engaged in terrorism as a means, as what they see as an effective revolutionary strategy. But they're not going to be wandering over to the United States to attack Americans. So these are places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, some parts of the Sahel region of Western Africa, and a handful of other places where the bulk of these revolutionary Islamists using terrorist methods are located. If we want to turn to the United States, how many are there in the United States? Well, after 9/11, the FBI director went to Congress and said he suspected that there were several hundred Al-Qaeda related militants in the United States. And he was concerned that the FBI needed to find those people before they create havoc here in the United States and do something again on the order of an attack of a scale of 9/11. There hasn't been anything nearly like that. We have found a handful of Al-Qaeda related terrorists in the United States, really about a dozen. And most of them were not very effective. They were the hangers-on and the stringers who were really not ready for the big leagues. We know this because they opened up very easily, in most cases, to FBI informants. And almost every case of a terrorist plot in the United States related to Islamic revolutionaries abroad, if there were two or more people in the room, one of them was an FBI informant. Now, we've been very fortunate that that's the case. There have been attacks. There have been, obviously, like the Boston Marathon bombing, there have been cases where militants have gotten a hold of weapons, they've gotten a hold of explosives, and they've actually detonated them. And there have been fatalities and there have been horrible injuries, and I don't mean to minimize that. Let's think, though, in terms of the threat to public safety here in the United States. There have been 37 deaths that we can potentially attribute to Islamic terrorism in the United States since 9/11. Let's add to that the 3,000 approximately on 9/11 itself. That's a horrible death toll. Over that same period, however, there have been more than 190,000 murders in the United States, and we have over 12,000 murders a year. So terrorism is not a leading cause of death. It is a minuscule portion of the murders that we see in the United States each year. Now, we want to get rid of it. I want to have, obviously, I'm not in favor of terrorism, and I don't mean to minimize it, but I do want to point out that in context, it is not a leading threat to public safety.
What about those terrorists that are overseas? Are they in any way a threat to the U.S.? Or should we be concerned about them in general?
Absolutely, in the way that we're concerned about all sorts of threats to public safety all over the world. There were, a virulent virus or revolutionary movements of all sorts of threats, war, civil war, organized crime. There's a huge number of threats to public safety. Many of them in our globalized world affect Americans. Things spread very quickly now around the world. Terrorism is one portion of that, and let's take it seriously, but let's not pretend that that is our main threat overseas or here in the United States.
What about training camps? Are they still being set up in Pakistan, in Afghanistan?
Yes, we know from all sorts of declassified evidence, I don't have access to the classified stuff, that training camps exist. What's interesting is that since the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, the size of those camps is tiny compared to what it was under the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. So at that time, they had hundreds or even thousands of people being trained, militants going through these camps at a time. Now the camps are very small. They're more and more isolated geographies. It's harder and harder to get there. They're way up in the mountains or out in the deserts and remote locations in West Africa or in Somalia. And the numbers going through those camps is much, much smaller. So the threat in that degree, from that perspective, has gone down by a factor of 10 or more since 9/11. And if we look at the amount of violence before and after 9/11, the amount of terrorism has actually been lower since 9/11 than it was in the years before 9/11, according to the Global Terrorism Database and other sources that try to track these things, excluding civil wars. So there's a handful of civil wars that are very bloody in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Pakistan. Those civil wars have generated a huge number of casualties. I mean, it's appalling, thousands of people a year. And that's where we see the bulk of terrorism fatalities these days. Outside of those civil wars, the numbers are considerably lower globally than they were before 9/11, fatalities from terrorism. We're actually living as a world in a much safer world than we did at any point in modern history. There are fewer interstate wars, wars between governments. There are fewer civil wars now than in previous decades. It's a remarkably safe place. Life expectancy is going up. We don't get that feeling from the news. And of course, there's tremendous misery going on. But in fact, the world is looking up these days, not to relax our attention on things we ought to be improving and making a commitment to improving, from public health to political violence to all sorts of things. But I think we should take some sort of sense of pride and relaxation, perhaps, and turn down the volume on our anxieties when we look at how much we have actually accomplished in reducing violence in the world.
Professor Kurzman, the reduction in terrorism in the world, is it due to some of the measures that we took after 9/11?
I think that has to be factored in. In some cases, the heightened attention and scrutiny and the crackdown on groups that were previously allowed to operate more or less with impunity. Almost every government in the world is now against terrorism and is trying to actively suppress terrorist groups in their territory. That wasn't necessarily the case before 9/11. All sorts of police actions, more incarceration, harsher legal treatment of people convicted of terrorism-related crimes. That's probably played into it. At the same time, most of what's going on here is that Muslims and